Hi, and welcome to this brief overview of the Interested Parties module. My name is Olivia Millard. I am on the Conservation by Design team, and I played a role in helping develop this module from its inception through to now, so I'm really excited to tell you what it's all about. The Interested Parties module is entirely new to Conservation by Design, and we don't know of another thing like it in other conservation planning methodologies either. We created it in response to teams that were asking for tools that they could use to incorporate equitable considerations into their conservation plans. It's a sort of a twist on what used to be called a stakeholder assessment, but it helps teams move their focus away from known entities who have power and influence in a system to an examination instead of who might be affected by changes in the system that come about as a result of our conservation initiatives. And it helps us think about who we need to learn more about and who should be involved in the planning and implementation of conservation initiatives. So you might be wondering, what is an interested party? Well, as it happens, when we first set out to create this tool, in response to teams who were asking for tools, first of all, that could help them incorporate equity and equity considerations into conservation, there were also a lot of teams asking for stakeholder assessments. There was no one way to do a traditional stakeholder assessment at the Nature Conservancy, and so we thought, well, let's put together a package of best practices. But pretty early on, we realized a couple of things. One, a traditional stakeholder assessment does help boost the interests of people who already know about an initiative or have a strong interest and have some influence in the initiative, and that there's a whole lot of work to be done in looking instead at people who are going to be affected by a conservation initiative and may not even know that the initiative is underway, taking place, that it ever exists. So we wanted, with this module, to better understand not just people who know about and want to be part of the strategy, but also people who will be affected one way or another, whether or not they know this work is happening. And why do we call them interested parties rather than stakeholders? Well, we learned pretty early on in our testing with conservation teams that the word stakeholder is really problematic for Indigenous Americans. It's a word that was used in early American laws like the Homestead Act and the Mining Claims Act to represent European settlers who had come to this country and wanted to put a stake in the ground to claim their land or their mining rights. And this, of course, completely disregarded the fact that there were already people whose traditional lands these were, who were then completely displaced by those laws and those European settlers. So the word stakeholder is super problematic for Indigenous Americans. And also, Indigenous people in the United States and in many other countries in the world have politically granted rights, as recognizing them as political entities under constitutions or treaties, with rights that go beyond property ownership rights, an essential fundamental right to the resources of the lands that they traditionally have occupied. So the word stakeholder doesn't work for that. The words stakeholders and rights holders is also not 100% inclusive. So we've settled on the term interested parties, which works well in the United States, but you might want to think about what the right word that has those sorts of principles underpinning it is that would work best in your context. So why is this part of the planning process important? Well, it makes for a more effective plan. It helps support Conservation by Design's strong push to incorporate equitable considerations into conservation planning. Teams have been asking for something concrete that they can pick up and use. And also, TNC's 2030 goal has an overall goal of positively affecting the lives of 45 million people, including people with increased ability to meaningfully participate in decision-making about territory or resources. And the Interested Parties module very directly helps teams support that part of the 2030 goal. Here's a paper published in 2021 that supports the idea that including interested parties, including equity, diversity, inclusiveness, and justice considerations helps improve the stability, the long-term effectiveness, the sustainability of a conservation plan. We also have evidence from within the Nature Conservancy of how helpful this module can be. The Michigan Field Office used it to examine a number of strategies across the chapter and found that they had identified a 6-fold increase of the number of interested parties that they hadn't been thinking about or known about before, including a number that spanned several strategies that allowed them to work towards alignment on those strategies in terms of their relationships towards those interested parties. In Conservation by Design, the Interested Parties module comes fairly early in the process, right after you've conducted your planning scope module and before you get into the real strategy development in subsequent modules. That said, it's a module that we think teams can come back to time and again. Once you've got a developed strategy, you may want to come back and re-examine your interested parties' understanding. You may only be able to get through the module for a limited number of parties the first time you use it, and so you might want to come back and flesh out what you initially discovered. We think it's also useful outside the conservation context, so have a look and see whether you agree. When we were developing the tool, we also came to recognize that if this module was going to be about equity and about interested parties who have an interest but may not even know that they do, part of what we need to focus on is helping the conservation team that's doing this work understand better who they need to learn more about. And that actually became the ultimate goal of this module. Not so much, again, the classic stakeholder assessment graph mapping interest and influence, but instead a similar looking graph and a number of other steps that help a team determine who it is that we know least about, that we really need to learn more about, and how can we set up a learning plan for ourselves going forward. The module uses 3 tools: the Interested Parties Assessment tool, which is in Mural, the Spectrum of Engagement, which uses an Excel workbook, and then we hand you off to the Human Rights Guide, which was created by the Nature Conservancy a few years ago, which is a really useful resource with concrete tools and ideas for how to move forward. This module and its associated resources can steer you in the right direction, but you'll need access to social science expertise and one or more persons on your team or among partners who can spend the time necessary to build and strengthen relationships with interested parties once you've identified them. These are some suggestions about who might participate in the Interested Parties module. Again, presumably, hopefully you will have completed the Integrating Equity module and the Planning Scope module, but you can always also come and revisit the Interested Parties module at any point in a conservation planning process, and I'm pretty confident it will bear fruit when you do that. Who should participate? Maybe if you're just beginning to develop a strategy, you would involve just your core team. Maybe there are some key partners that you always work with that you know you want to involve. And then as time goes on, as you learn more about the interested parties, you may want to start including interested parties in the interested module in the process itself, where they can help you identify additional interested parties going forward. So the Interested Parties module will inform the entire rest of the work that you do in Conservation by Design by confirming or identifying who you'll engage and then how you'll engage them in the rest of your planning process, including for each of these modules. So the major steps involved in the Interested Parties module include starting by brainstorming all of the potential interested parties that you can think of with prompts to help you think inclusively and expansively. And there are some tools for helping you note which parties have equity considerations or are rights holders. And then you run the interested parties you've brainstormed through a couple of filters. This is a screenshot of the entire mural board that you'll use in the Interested Parties module, showing you what those filters look like. You'll place the interested parties you've identified on a sector and scale grid, and then check to see how many interested parties you've identified that are relatively new to you. And then you can reflect on whether you might have missed one or more parties and add them to your mural board. It's a cumulative process and an iterative, additive process, and you'll hopefully end up, by the time you've gone through a few filters, with more interested parties than you initially brainstormed. You'll then go through and for each interested party and answer key questions, including what their interests are in the system, whether they're experiencing inequities, their level of influence, our level of knowledge about them, and what we want to better understand about them. And then the Spectrum of Engagement tool is designed to foster thoughtful and possibly sometimes difficult conversations about what level of engagement is appropriate for each interested party. The levels of engagement you'll see in the spectrum range from ignore at what end, proceeding through increasing levels of engagement, including inform, consult, involve, and collaborate, to defer to at the other end of the spectrum for situations where the interested party really should be driving decision making. And then the module sends you to the Human Rights Guide for some basic guidance on how to learn more about interested parties and how to begin initiating relationships with them. So these are the key products that will come out of your interested parties module work. A database, which is a long-term tool that you can hang on to and continue to build over time, unlike the Mural board, which is where you do your workshopping. The database is a place that your team can refer back to and continue to fill in over time. It's also really handy for handing off work from one set of people on a team to another. And then a plan for learning more about the priority interested parties that you don't know enough about. And then an engagement plan. The Human Rights Guide has a template for an engagement plan that will help you think about how you're going to initiate discussions and establish relationships with interested parties. So the Guide to Working with Interested Parties is a companion piece. I mentioned earlier, or you know by now, that modules are intended to be a set of tools that you can pick up and work with as a team that in a time-bound manner and come out with a product at the end that you can then use to build on to move forward in your conservation planning work. There's a lot to building relationships though, and you can't in a time-bound fashion say, well, we're going to build a relationship and then go ahead and build that relationship in that same time-bound way. Instead, relationships take time, they take the development of trust, they take good communication. It might be that this is something that you are working on for the entirety of the length of your strategy for years. And so there are other tools that are useful that can help teams understand best practices around building relationships with interested parties. So we put those resources together in this companion piece, the Guide to Working with Interested Parties, which is worth having a look. It contains links to resources inside and outside the Nature Conservancy that detail, summarize the best practices that we have learned and others have learned through years of working with partners and communities and other sorts of interested parties. So have a look at the guide when you get a chance. I'll end with this list of resources. This is a complete list of the resources that support the use of the Interested Parties module, the ones that I described to you here today, as well as the Interested Parties module document, which basically goes over what I went over in this video, and then two facilitators guides, one for the Interested Parties Assessment Tool, or IPAT, one for the Spectrum of Engagement, that provide really detailed step-by-step guidance for facilitators on how to facilitate this module. Thanks for staying with me for these 13 minutes, and please contact me if you have any questions. My name is Olivia Millard, and I'm at omillard@tnc.org. Thanks.